The morning the nation stopped, I was ironing a tablecloth. Not a small one of the long, formal ones, ivory damask, that takes 20 minutes to do properly if you're doing it right, and I was doing it right because that's the only way I know. The iron made its sound, that low, pressurized hiss, and the radio was on low in the corner of the linen room, and that's how I heard it. The announcer's voice went different. That particular flatness that isn't sadness exactly, more like the air being taken out of something. The Duke of Carlisle had died in the night. I set the iron down on its heel. I didn't turn the radio up. I just stood there with my hand still open in the shape of holding something. I'd met him once. Properly met him, I mean. Not in the way where you stand in a line and he moves down it. He'd come through the East Corridor 2 years after I started, back when I was still young enough to be nervous about everything, and he'd stopped and asked me what I was carrying, and I'd told him, fresh-cut flowers for the blue sitting room, lilacs and something white I couldn't name, and he'd said, good choice, lilacs always smell like an argument you've just won, and he'd walked on. I'd thought about that sentence a lot since. 18 years I'd worked in these walls. You learn not to make things personal. You learn to be a pair of hands, a set of tasks, a uniform that moves at the right speed and makes the right amount of noise, which is not very much. You learn to see everything and file it somewhere quiet where it can't do any damage. I picked up the iron, I finished the tablecloth, and the news came down through the proper channels at 8:45, a senior member of the household, very composed, very brief, telling us what had happened and what was now required of us. Flowers to be arranged, rooms to be opened, a certain order to everything. We nodded, we dispersed. I was carrying a stack of pressed linens to the upper corridor when I saw them. They were standing in the alcove off the main passage, the one with the tall window that looks out over the east garden, where the light comes in cold and clear in the mornings. The prince had his back partly to me. His wife was facing him, one hand on his arm, saying something low that I couldn't hear. He nodded once. Then he put his face down briefly, just briefly, toward the top of her head. She put her hand flat on his back. Not patting, not rubbing. Just there, the whole weight of her palm. Steady. I had the linens against my chest, and I stood there for 3 seconds longer than I should have, and I watched a man who had spent his entire life being watched allow himself one moment of being held by someone who knew him. Then I turned and went the other way down the corridor. In my hands, the folded napkins were still warm from the iron. I held them tighter than necessary. I counted the doors as I passed them. There were 7 doors between the alcove and the linen cupboard, and I counted every one of them, and I did not think about anything else at all. By the time I reached the cupboard, my hands had stopped doing the thing they were doing, which was shaking very slightly, and I stacked the linens on the shelf and closed the door and stood in the narrow space between the shelf and the wall and breathed. The Duke had smelled of pipe tobacco and something like cedar. I'd noticed that too when he stopped to ask me about the flowers. I hadn't thought about it in years. Some things aren't meant to be witnessed. I'd always believed that. The whole architecture of this work is built around that belief. You learn to be invisible, to move through private moments without catching them, to look precisely far enough ahead that you never accidentally arrive somewhere real. But some things you witness whether you mean to or not, and then they are inside you, and there is nothing to be done about it. I went back to work. There was always more work. The public queue had formed outside the gates by noon. I could see it from the window of the upper corridor. A long, dark line of people stretching back along the road, moving slowly, their breath making small white clouds in the cold. They'd brought flowers. Cellophane-wrapped bunches mostly, the kind from petrol stations and corner shops, the kind that would have embarrassed him if he'd known. I thought he probably would have laughed about that. By 12:30, we'd been briefed on the afternoon schedule. The prince and princess would receive a delegation of civic officials at 2 o'clock. At 4, they would walk briefly along the front of the gates to acknowledge the public crowd. Between those 2 points, there were 6 other smaller things I no longer remember exactly. Briefings, calls, a photographer who wasn't supposed to be where he was and had to be quietly redirected. A flower arrangement in the main reception room that someone decided was the wrong kind of white and needed to be replaced. I was not in any of those rooms. I was adjacent to all of them. That is what 18 years teaches you, how to be adjacent. I watched the princess speak with the delegation. She had a way of listening that I had always noticed. Not the performed listening that some people do, where the eyes are on you but the mind is somewhere filing things away. This was the other kind, the kind that costs something. You could see it cost her something. She sat very straight, and her hands were folded, and she gave each person who spoke the full weight of her attention, the way a good surgeon gives the full weight of their attention to an X-ray, looking for what she needed to understand. And the prince stood slightly behind her and to the left for most of it. Once, when a woman from the delegation said something that caught him off guard, something about the Duke in his younger years, a story I couldn't quite hear, his face did something fast and private that was gone before most people would have caught it. I caught it. I was holding a plastic cup of tea that someone had pressed into my hands an hour ago, and that had been cold for 45 minutes. I was still holding it because putting it down would have required me to decide where to put it down, and I hadn't managed that yet. The afternoon moved the way afternoons do in a house of carefully managed grief. Each hour full, each transition smooth, every rough edge filed before it could catch anyone. At 4 o'clock, they went out to the gates. I wasn't supposed to be at that window. My work had me 2 corridors away. I went to that window anyway and stood at the edge of it where I wouldn't be seen. The crowd was bigger than I'd expected. People had been arriving all afternoon, standing in the cold for hours, holding their petrol station flowers and their handwritten notes on folded paper. A lot of older people, a lot of very ordinary faces. The princess walked the line slowly. She didn't rush it. She stopped and bent toward an elderly woman, tiny woman, scarf wrapped twice around, clutching a bunch of yellow chrysanthemums. And she went down, not just leaning, kneeling on the damp ground, right there so they were eye level. So the old woman didn't have to look up. There were no cameras nearby. I checked. She just stayed down there, eye level, for as long as it took. Maybe the old woman said something. The princess nodded and nodded again, and then she put her hand briefly over the woman's hand on the railing. I had gone cold somewhere in my middle, and I couldn't locate exactly where. Grief isn't private. I'd always thought that was the problem with it. It was too large to keep inside. It seeped into everything. It made a public mess of you, whether you meant it to or not. But watching her kneel in the wet in front of a stranger, I understood for the first time that I had that backwards. Grief isn't private, but the real kind always feels like it should be. The tea in my cup had gone completely cold, and I poured it into a nearby plant and went back to work. By evening, the flags were all at half-mast, and I still hadn't eaten. This wasn't unusual. On busy days, I sometimes got to 7 o'clock on nothing but the cups of tea other people handed me and the habit of motion. My feet knew the floors of this place the way you know your own teeth, without having to think about it, without having to look. Left at the portrait, down 2 steps. Wait for the sound of the door before you turn the corner. I had worn a groove in these stones without knowing it. The evening schedule was winding down. The delegation had gone. The flowers had been rearranged twice and were finally acceptable. Someone had found a candle of the wrong color in the blue sitting room, and there had been a brief, whispered argument about it that I'd stepped around like a puddle. I was cutting through the side corridor, the short route between the east wing and the service stairs, when I heard the voices. Low. Or 2 of them. I should have turned around. The door was 3/4 closed, and the etiquette of 3/4 closed doors is one of the first things you learn in this work. It is closed enough. Turn around. I didn't turn around in time. I pushed the door open another 6 inches without thinking. The way you do when your mind is somewhere else and your hands are just navigating. And I saw them. The prince was sitting on the arm of one of the side chairs. Not in it properly, just perched, the way people sit when they are too tired to commit to sitting. His wife was standing in front of him. She was saying something very quietly. Her hands were in his hair. He was crying. Not loudly. Not the kind of crying that announces itself. The kind that happens when all the other options have been exhausted and there is nothing left but this. His shoulders were doing that careful, deliberate stillness of a person trying very hard not to do the thing they are doing. Her hands moved slowly through his hair. I had the door handle in my grip and I held it, and I did not breathe, and I did not move. 2 years ago, my husband Roy had a stroke on a Wednesday morning in March and was gone by the Thursday. 61 years old. We'd been married for 22 of them, which wasn't enough, and was also sometimes everything. I had not cried at his funeral. I had organized it instead. I had made sandwiches and answered the door and sent thank you notes within the week and gone back to work after 10 days and been fine. I had been very, very fine. I watched a man cry in a side room with his wife's hands in his hair, and I backed out of the door and pulled it closed to 3/4 again, and I stood in the corridor with my back against the wall, and all 18 years of being fine came undone at once. Not loudly. I am not a loud person. But I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor with my knees up, and my uniform riding wrong, and my hands pressed flat to the cold stone on either side of me, and I just sat there, in the corridor, in the quiet. The door handle had left a mark on my palm. I looked at it. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that the light in the corridor shifted. Long enough that my feet went cold. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular. That was the strange part. I wasn't thinking about Roy or the Duke or the Prince crying or any of it. But I was just sitting on the floor in my uniform, feeling the cold of the stone through my tights, and noticing that there was a very small crack running along the baseboard near my left knee that I'd never seen before, even though I'd walked this corridor thousands of times. I heard the door. I didn't look up straight away. Footsteps, quiet and careful. Not the brisk, purposeful footsteps of someone with somewhere to be. The other kind. She sat down next to me. Not standing over me, not crouching with her hands on her knees in the concerned posture. She just sat down, on the floor. In that corridor, in whatever she was wearing, just sat down beside me and said nothing for a long moment. I stared at the crack in the baseboard. "Long day," she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't the opening move of a management conversation or a welfare check or any of the things it could have been. It was just a thing to say that meant, "I know. I see you. You don't have to explain." "Yes," I said. We sat there a bit longer. Then she put her hand into her pocket. And I don't know what I expected. I wasn't expecting anything. I wasn't thinking ahead at all. And she held out a tissue. Linen. Folded into a small square. Monogrammed in pale thread at the corner, a small, simple C, the kind of monogram you had to look for. I looked at it. "Thank you," I said, and I took it, and I pressed it against my face, and I didn't make a sound, but she sat there until I was done. She stood up first, smoothed her skirt. I started to say something, an apology, a professional thing, the correct thing, and she shook her head once, a brief and clear. Then she was gone. I sat there a little longer. The floor was very cold. The crack in the baseboard was about 6 inches long, thin as a hair, and ran in a very slightly curved line, like it was going somewhere, like it had somewhere to be. I looked at the tissue in my hand. The C was stitched in a color almost the same as the linen, just one shade darker. You'd miss it if you weren't looking. I folded it back into its square. I put it in my uniform pocket. I got up off the floor. She went back to work the next morning. That's the only way I know how to say it. In the third person, from a little distance. Because when I think about that woman getting up off that corridor floor and going back to the ironing room and starting a new pile, she seems like someone slightly different from the woman I am now. And not a lot different. Enough. The nation mourned for 10 days. There were services and silences and the slow ceremonial machinery of public grief doing what it is built to do, giving people somewhere to put it, a shape for it, a place in time where it is permitted and held. I moved through those 10 days differently. I can't explain it better than that. Not differently in any dramatic sense. I still ironed the tablecloths. I still knew where the crack in the baseboard was. I still made the right amount of noise, which was not very much, but something that had been running on a very tight setting had been adjusted, and I could feel the difference, even if I couldn't have pointed to it. On the third day, I called my sister. We had not spoken properly in 8 months. Not because of a falling out. There was no falling out. We had just been busy in that particular way that is really just a slow, quiet drifting, the kind you don't notice until you're quite far from shore. She answered on the second ring and said, "Donna," finally in the voice that meant she had been waiting, and we talked for an hour and a half about Roy, about the Duke, about nothing important, about everything. On the 5th day, I booked a weekend away, a small place on the coast that I'd been meaning to book for 2 years, for a specific reason that I didn't need to name to the woman on the phone who took my card details. I went. It rained the entire first day and was cold and gray the whole of the second, and I walked on the beach in my good coat and ate fish and chips from paper in a shelter looking out at the water, and I thought about Roy telling me once that he wanted to see every coastline in England before he died, and how we hadn't gotten to even half of them. I thought maybe I could do some of the others. On the day I got back, I found the tissue in the inside pocket of my uniform, where I'd put it the night I sat on the floor. I'd had the uniform dry cleaned by then. The tissue had survived it. The little C in the corner was still there, one shade darker than the linen, the kind you'd miss if you weren't looking. I put it in the small wooden box on my dresser where I keep the things I'm keeping. Nobody gets through it alone, not even them. I know that now. And I knew it before, the way you know things you've never let yourself know, filed away in that quiet place where they can't do any damage. The difference is I stopped filing. That's the whole of it, really. That's the thing I didn't know the morning I was ironing the tablecloth and the radio went flat and the nation stopped. You can go a long time holding everything together with both hands, very neatly, very correctly. You can go a long time before someone sits down beside you on a cold floor and hands you something small, and you finally let yourself take it. We had not spoken properly in 8 months. Not because of a falling out. There was no falling out. We had just been busy in that particular way that is really just a slow, quiet drifting, the kind you don't notice until you're quite far from shore. And she answered on the second ring and said, "Donna," finally in the voice that meant she had been waiting, and we talked for an hour and a half about Roy, about the Duke, about nothing important, about everything. On the 5th day, I booked a weekend away, a small place on the coast that I'd been meaning to book for 2 years, for a specific reason that I didn't need to name to the woman on the phone who took my card details. I went. It rained the entire first day and was cold and gray the whole of the second, and I walked on the beach in my good coat and ate fish and chips from paper in a shelter, looking out at the water. And I thought about Roy telling me once that he wanted to see every coastline in England before he died, and how we hadn't gotten to even half of them. I thought maybe I could do some of the others. On the day I got back, I found the tissue in the inside pocket of my uniform, where I'd put it the night I sat on the floor. I'd had the uniform dry cleaned by then. The tissue had survived it. The little C in the corner was still there, one shade darker than the linen, the kind you'd miss if you weren't looking. I put it in the small wooden box on my dresser where I keep the things I'm keeping. Nobody gets through it alone, not even them. I know that now. I knew it before, the way you know things you've never let yourself know, filed away in that quiet place where they can't do any damage. The difference is, I stopped filing. That's the whole of it, really. That's the thing I didn't know the morning I was ironing the tablecloth and the radio went flat and the nation stopped. That you can go a long time holding everything together with both hands, very neatly, very correctly. You can go a long time before someone sits down beside you on a cold floor and hands you something small, and you finally let yourself take it.